So I'm going to spend about 5 minutes or so talking through what I think are 5 key points that come out of the report. And I'd like to do that by starting off with the quote from UNESCO, which I think is quite apt, which is, "Technology can be a powerful educational multiplier, but we must know how to use it. It is not enough to install technology into classrooms. It must be integrated into learning. Nothing can substitute for the good teacher." So the key points for me there was this technocentric focus on installing technologies into classrooms, which clearly we don't want. We need a much stronger focus on teachers and on pedagogical design with edtech. So we can really then address how do we integrate technology into pupil and, I would say, teachers' learning. And the last point then, nothing can substitute for a good teacher. I think particularly those coming from a technical background, which is where initially I came from. I think we can overlook the complexities of teaching and the nature of classroom practice and how challenging it can be to embed technology into those contexts. Which brings me to my first point. There's been a lot of work, and you can read it in the report, on teachers' use of technologies. And while this is quite valid, worthwhile, there's been a lot of good work done on understanding what they do day to day. It's very much focused on their technical literacy, if you like. So how they can use technology, Word, etc., to prepare notes. Are they good at using the internet? Power and infrastructural issues that they may have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But I'd like to make the distinction, I think the report makes the distinction very well, between that use and actually use in practice. So the practice-based focus has been much, much richer. So how, from a pedagogical point of view, can teachers take the technology and use it in their teaching practice? We've looked at that in 2 ways. One is to think about subject-specific pedagogies, and Tom's work has been very critical here in expanding work and research in this area. So, for example, instead of just thinking about technology in the classroom, we might want to say, for example, in the context of language learning, what pedagogies are useful. And one was CLT, communicative language teaching. So then we think about that pedagogy, how teachers use that, and how teachers can then use technology in the context of using that pedagogy. So it's a much more focused approach to thinking about the implementation of technology in practice. The second point related to that is really thinking about the nature of the technology, the functions of the technology. Why would you use particular technologies, example mobile phones, tablets, desktops, etc., when pen and paper may do? Okay, so what's a clear rationale that you can go, say, to ministers and ministers of education? Why should they invest in technology? If they come back and say, well, that pedagogy can be implemented with pen and paper. You should be thinking about interesting and effective ways of using technology. So one really simple example is in mathematics education. So you can use dynamic geometry tools that show you the relationship between angles and represent them in different and dynamic ways on a computer screen. That gives students an insight into the relationship between the angles, for example, rather than having to use equations. So the representation that the technology gives you is new and interesting and may be of benefit to some students that traditional methods may not be as effective. The other, for example, there's been lots of work in mobile learning and using the creative abilities, if you like, of students using mobile phones, for example, filmmaking, teachers even in teacher training, using the recording ability of phones to record each other's teaching practice and reflect upon that. So, for example, using the functionalities of the technology there to support the pedagogy of reflective practice. And there are a number of other examples talked about in the report, so I'd encourage you to go and read those. The Third point I'll come to now is a little bit more conceptual. It's about learning theory and being explicit about the learning theory you're using. I think the team would agree that we didn't find enough projects that were really explicit about the theory, the learning theory that underpinned the design of their educational technology. And this is useful for two reasons, really. One is it can be linked to a area of education. So researchers or practitioners can come to it and say, we're interested in using a behaviorist approach to learning, for example, using drill and practice tools, SMS quizzes, that kind of thing. And here's how this work we're doing relates to educational research. So you can embed or you can relate your work, your own project, to a educational tradition and draw on evidence of how that changes or affects learning in a more productive manner. Next point is the strong focus on teacher training. And this has been made in other reports again. But I think the nuance that we've addressed here is the focus on design and the importance of design. So if you're developing an educational intervention, teacher training must go beyond developing particular competencies. Okay, so instead of being primarily competency driven, it's how can teachers be involved in the process to help you design a better intervention. So how can they tell you about their practice, how their practice works in their particular context, the challenges they face, and how can they be addressed in the development of the tool, particularly the iterative development. So they should be involved as soon as possible, if possible, really from day one, as key and equal partners. The final point is a larger point. It's about generating evidence. And we hear a lot about that these days, evidence-based interventions. But I think the key point there is, what does that mean? And personally, I think that the field of edtech is not at the point where it's ready to design quality randomized controlled trials to generate gold standard, if you like, evidence. I think what we're much better doing at is understanding or knowing that what we're designing, an educational technology intervention, is a complex intervention, and therefore we should be doing programming context evaluations before we move on to randomized controlled trials. And I think there's a lot of work to do in that area. It's a key point for future work. And I think I'll end by thinking about the future as well, and what might another key point I think that we need to address, and that's the point about who is this aimed at the end of the day. And I think if we're working in developing in low-income countries, it's essentially the populations of those countries who are often marginalized. So the question I think that we need to bring into educational technologies is, what does it mean to take a social justice framing on edtech, and what challenges does that raise for the community?